North America wasn't just shaped by European empires. It was forged in the shadows of its forests, where a native confederacy rose to command fear and respect from both France and England. The Iroquois weren't passive victims of conquest. They were power brokers, warriors, and diplomats who forced kings across the ocean to reckon with their choices. At a time when muskets clashed with tomahawks and empires struggled for control, it was the Longhouse that quietly bent the balance of power. When Europeans first arrived, they didn't just bring trade goods and strange new weapons. They carried something far deadlier: disease. Entire villages were emptied in weeks, longhouses abandoned, elders and warriors alike struck down by invisible enemies. The balance that had held for generations collapsed almost overnight. But out of this devastation came change. Muskets and powder began to flood native trade routes, turning old rivalries into brutal new wars. And no nation adapted faster than the Iroquois. They saw weapons not as curiosities, but as tools of survival and dominance. Where others faltered, the Longhouse prepared for something bigger, a campaign that would shake the entire continent. By the mid-1600s, the Iroquois launched what became known as the Beaver Wars. On the surface, it was about furs, the lifeblood of European trade, but beneath it lay something deeper: control. Whoever owned the hunting grounds controlled the guns, the goods, and the fragile web of alliances tying Europe to the New World. Iroquois war parties swept across the forests and waterways. French outposts burned. Algonquin allies were scattered, and the once powerful Huron Confederacy was broken apart. Jesuit missionaries wrote of villages vanishing overnight, of smoldering ruins where entire towns had stood. For many in New France, it seemed nothing could halt the Longhouse's advance. But the Iroquois weren't simply chasing conquest. They were reshaping the rules of survival, proving that no European colony was untouchable. And this was only the beginning. For all their ferocity in battle, the Iroquois knew power wasn't won by the musket alone. They were masters of diplomacy, wielding words and wampum belts with the same precision they brought to war. An envoy could be as dangerous as a raiding party. One promise, one warning, carried on a string of beads that bound agreements as tightly as chains. To the English in Albany, the Iroquois offered friendship and trade, promising loyalty that made New York sleep easier at night. To the French in Montreal, they offered something different: veiled threats, or peace on their terms, whichever tilted the balance in their favor. This wasn't submission, it was strategy. Every alliance, every negotiation was part of a bigger game, one in which the Iroquois made themselves too valuable and too dangerous for either empire to ignore. Section 4. Clash with the French. The French couldn't afford to ignore the threat. Governors dispatched soldiers, scouts, and native allies to strike back. But once they left their fortified towns along the St. Lawrence, they entered a world that belonged to the Iroquois. In the dense forests, ambushes waited behind every tree line. French expeditions meant to crush the Longhouse. Men instead found themselves scattered, cut down, or retreating in panic. Entire settlements were wiped away in surprise raids, leaving behind only ashes. Yet France wasn't without its strengths. Stone forts guarded the St. Lawrence. Loyal allies like the Algonquin and Ottawa fought at their side. And from across the Atlantic, reinforcements continued to arrive. It became a grinding stalemate. The French clinging to their river strongholds, the Iroquois dominating the forests, and both sides bleeding for every mile of ground. But the English were watching closely, and they saw an opportunity. Section 5. The English Connection. To the English, The Iroquois were more than neighbors. They were a shield. As long as the Longhouse kept pressure on the French, New York's colonies could breathe easy. Traders flooded Iroquois villages with muskets, powder, and goods, binding the Confederacy ever tighter to England's empire. But this was never a one-sided deal. The Iroquois reminded their English brothers that they bowed to no crown across the sea. They accepted gifts, traded furs, and fought alongside the Redcoats when it suited them. But they never surrendered their independence. It was a dangerous balancing act. The Iroquois played the role of ally without ever becoming a subject, and in doing so, they made themselves indispensable. Neither empire could act in North America without first wondering, what will the Longhouse do? And by the 1680s, that question would explode into a continental crisis. By the late 1600s, the Beaver Wars reached their breaking point. The Iroquois were locked in battle not just with the French, but with a web of nations: Algonquin, Ottawa, Miami, and more, each alliance pulling the conflict wider. In 1689, the fury of the Longhouse hit its peak at La Chine, a French settlement near Montreal. Under cover of night, Iroquois raiders struck with terrifying speed. Dozens were killed or carried off, and panic rippled through New France. To many colonists, it felt like the entire colony might collapse. But the Iroquois were bleeding, too. Endless campaigns had emptied villages, fields lay untended, and grief hung heavy in longhouses. The Confederacy faced a harsh truth. Even victory could mean ruin if the war never ended. And so, from the ashes of exhaustion, a new path began to take shape. After decades of fire and blood, the Iroquois realized survival meant more than winning battles. It meant shaping peace. In 1701, envoys from over 30 nations converged on Montreal. The city's squares filled with wampum belts, pipes and speeches that carried the weight of generations. The French, battered and desperate, sought an end to the raids that threatened their colony. Their native allies longed for breathing space. And the Iroquois. They arrived not as defeated warriors, but as power brokers. The treaty that followed recognized them not as subjects, but as sovereign partners in a fragile balance of power. It was a peace born not of trust, but of exhaustion. Yet in that moment, the Iroquois had forced two empires to meet them as equals, something few other nations in the New World ever achieved. But peace written on paper rarely lasts, and the storm of history was far from over. The Great Peace of Montreal was a milestone, but it was only a pause in a storm. Within decades, new wars swept across the continent: the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and the relentless push of settlers westward. Each conflict forced the Iroquois to choose sides, and each choice carried a heavy price. Yet their legacy from the 17th century remained undeniable. They had bent empires to their will, forcing kings and governors across the ocean to reckon with them. In an age where European armies believed themselves unstoppable, the Iroquois proved otherwise. Though betrayal and loss would come, their story endures as a reminder. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, a free people can shape history. Their voice, carried through diplomacy and war alike, echoed louder than the cannons of kings.